The first time the idea was called crazy, the desert was still in the morning and the Panzers were still right where they liked to be. Somewhere you didn't expect until they were already in your sight. The signaler's name was Private First Class Daniel Pike, a kid whose hands looked too clean for the grease on the floor plates and whose ears had learned to live inside a headset. He was credited with nothing and blamed for everything that sounded wrong in a Sherman. His job was the voice. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, he learned how loud silence can be. The German guns were fine instruments played by men who had practiced. The American battalion's radios, when they worked, fought back with static, skip, and overlapping orders that turned into arguments. The only messages that made the trip from one ridge to another were the ones shouted through open hatches and guessed at by drivers who were already a gear too late. Armor is a drama that looks like steel. Most of it is actually grammar. The grammar at Kasserine was broken. Pike was not an engineer. He was a listener. He listened to the way the SCR 508 sounded when the net was clean and when it was dirty, when the crystal-controlled frequency sat square in its slot, and when someone breathed on the tuning like a prayer that moved the needle anyway. He noticed that when the company stayed tight and spoke short, the net cut through the world. He noticed that the German AM sets, where they existed in the first place, flailed in static like men trying to swim in a sack. You could hear their frustration in the jagged bursts that stumbled over each other on the air. He also noticed that the Shermans with dead sets died, like people trying to read lips in a fire. The crews did not need more armor. They needed to be in the same sentence. The crazy part came a week after the first debacle, when the battalion was rearming and the officers were pretending to prefer maps to weather. Pike sketched a plan on the back of a maintenance form that smelled of oil and dust. The SCR 508s would stay where they were bolted, but the way they talked would change. Each platoon would hold its own FM whisper at one end of the band. The company would hold another. The battalion would live above them like a roof. The trick wasn't equipment, it was choreography. Tanks would carry two nets in their heads, one ear for the platoon's short knife, one for the company's longer arm. One tank per platoon would sit heavier on the company frequency to act as a relay when terrain ate the signal. Net control would not ride the loudest mouth, but the quietest brain. The platoon leader, whose voice did not change when the tracers started to sketch their red arithmetic. Orders would be brevity words married to map grids. Confirmation would be a single syllable, not a speech. A contact report would be a noun plus a number, not a paragraph about fear. A lieutenant called it naive. A captain called it too many nets, too many crystals, not enough time. A sergeant who had already learned to trust the kid who kept the static away said, "Let him try it on the range." Pike did not ask for a range. He asked for a patrol. The next day, a platoon of Shermans moved through a dry wadi with an FM link that behaved like a family secret. The tanks stayed in the weeds, and the words stayed even shorter than the tracks. Left 2. Hold. 3 o'clock dust. Step. They reached the far lip without giving the wadi its usual tacks in broken track shoes. The lieutenant who had said naive watched the recording Pike kept, a ridiculous set of pencil lines that matched the net's breath. And he did not apologize. He just handed the kid a box of crystals and told him to build a roof strong enough for a fight. You can't understand what changed without hearing it. Frequency modulation turns speech into a signal that doesn't care much about the weather's whining. Amplitude modulation turns speech into a hostage. A 25-watt transmitter in a Sherman's turret wall could push a clean voice farther than any captain thought, provided the net behaved like a disciplined chorus instead of a crowd at a ball game. On the other side, a 10-watt AM set in a Panzer, if the Panzer had a set at all, could be bullied by geography and betrayed by its own noise. Static is not just an inconvenience, it is a tax on decision. Every extra syllable you repeat is a second in which a gunner waits with his turret at the wrong azimuth. Pike did not need a lab to know the difference. He needed a ridge and an argument. The ridge was always there. The argument ended the first time a platoon killed by clockwork because the net didn't stumble. Tunisia gave them the first clean proof because the desert never lies about distances. A company put Pike's plan to work against a group of Panzers that had come to teach a lesson and found themselves in a classroom with new rules. The Shermans moved like a hand opening and closing. The platoon net kept the fingers coordinated. The company net told the hand when to clench. A relay tank, parked on a small knuckle of ground that saw more world than its friends, whispered across an FM bridge that held even when the wind pushed sand like a vindictive god. The German commander tried to bring his own hand down in a chop. His radios, when he had them, brought him half a rumor at a time. He had to move to see what his tanks were doing. When he moved, he had to stop listening. When he stopped listening, he made the move that a man makes when he is trying to read and drive. He drifted out of the center. The Shermans hit where the hand was weakest, not where the armor was strongest. Pike took notes that night by the light of a blackout lamp and turned them into a one-page catechism for signalers who were tired of being treated like men who only swapped boxes. The catechism was simple. Establish the net before you see the enemy. Test and step through the crystals. Assign one relay per platoon. Forbid unnecessary words. Reward silence. Punish overlap. Script the company net with times. Let the platoon net breathe. Never run the battalion net through a hero. The list read like manners because it was manners. The air has its own etiquette, and when you violate it, the air stops carrying your secrets. A tank can be a cathedral to noise. FM made the hymns legible. Germany did not hear the difference because it did not want to. Machinery had become theology. Tigers and Panthers were liturgy, barrel length, armor slope, optics that could peel the wings off a fly. To the crews inside them, the radio was a clerk in the sacristy. Useful, perhaps, but not the point. In too many cases, it was absent. 20% of Panzers carried a set at all. Among those, the 10-watt AM voices were fragile. When those crews did coordinate, they did it by habit and by hand. Habit moves slowly. Hands must be raised to be seen. Pike, whose hands never rose above his turret rim, learned to make a company move like a rumor with edges. Once you have that, the rest of the mathematics gets kinder. The net took shape like a bridge that nobody stopped driving over long enough to finish painting. Pike carved it into layers. At the bottom, the platoon net. Intimate, staccato, always on the edge of a whisper. In the middle, the company net. Tempo, timing, the syncopation that lets 3 fists hit the same door at once. At the top, the battalion net. Fewer voices, fewer words, more maps, an orchestra conductor who keeps his hands small because his players are not looking up. He wrote brevity codes that sounded like kitchen English instead of salon French. Scratch for a minor hit. Blind for smoke in the periscope. Pin for a gun holding you down. Brake for a flanking turn. He paired each code with a coordinate discipline that forced every mouth to learn the grid like a prayer. The point was to make language move faster than steel without tripping over itself. Net control station discipline was the part that made officers nervous because it removed the romance. NCS was not a hero's perch. It was a clerk's desk. The best NCS tank was the one whose commander could count to 5 before speaking, who measured his voice like powder, who knew when to be the metronome and when to let the band play the bar on its own. Pike's rule was ruthless. If the NCS stepped on a platoon net while the platoon was in contact, the NCS would be relieved of that duty on the next halt. A wise captain backed him. What came out the other end was a sound that would have been impossible with AM sets and wishful thinking. A company pivoting around cover points, as if they had rehearsed with chalk on a hangar floor, not churned through mud and smoke with their hearts going like they wanted out. The checklist lived on paper taped to turret walls. Before rolling, crystals seated, antennas checked for brakes, cokes inspected, power verified, call signs swapped to today's list, authentication pads ready, clock synced to the battalion second. On halt, relay assignments confirmed, signal strength tested, alternate frequencies staged, brevity codes rehearsed out loud in 30 seconds because a mouth remembers what a hand has said. In contact, NCS quiet unless timing. Platoon leaders own their patch of sky. Gunners talk only numbers. Drivers say nothing except distance and angle. Loaders keep a finger on the transmit key the way a sprinter keeps a finger on the starting line. Ready, not distracted. After, reports in 3 sentences, damage in 2 words, praise in 1. It sounded doctrinal and tedious on paper. It felt like oxygen in the fight. A Sherman with a clean net could run a gun like a hand tool, not a musical instrument that needed genius to coax. The crazy part became the new normal. Nobody waited for permission to avoid a shell. Nobody turned a perfect flank into a sermon. And nobody wasted the battalion net on the sort of color commentary that kills men. Pike's FM house had rooms that people could live in. The Germans he faced had apartments where the lights flickered, and the walls were too thick for neighbors to hear when the ceiling fell. Hills tried to murder FM. In Sicily, and then up the calf of Italy, the company learned that line of sight is a jealous god. The SCR 508 could push a clear voice across miles of open desert. In broken country, it stopped at ridge lines like a stubborn mule. Pike's answer was not better magic. It was better placement. He began to treat 1 tank per platoon as a mast. On the move, that tank would look for shoulders of ground where 2 valleys could be married by a voice. The mast tank did not always shoot the most. It often killed the most by letting others shoot. Sometimes the mast was a radio jeep riding the edge of infantry who had learned the beauty of being in the same sentence as steel. Sometimes it was a command tank backed into a notch with its antenna just high enough to kiss the horizon. Artillery joined the net like a cousin who brings an instrument and makes the band professional. FM lets you be exact in a way that maps alone cannot manage under fire. Pin, 7.8 left, orchard wall, splash in 30, said more in 5 seconds than a paragraph ever could. The battery clock ticked. The world thumped in the right place. Shermans shifted 2 hull lengths and caught the Panzers moving as if someone had pulled the carpet sideways. Air arrived less often and with more ceremony, but even fighters with radios that didn't love tank nets could be tied in by a liaison who learned to translate brevity into a pilot's patience. AM radios could have done some of this with a following wind and a silent sun. They rarely had either. FM made weather a servant instead of a tyrant. Italy demanded a new casualty list. Antennas and cokes chewed by hedges, connectors crushed by a careless boot, crystals cracked by a hatch slammed because a shell landed near enough to take away the idea of gentle. Pike turned into the kind of quartermaster nobody likes until the day you need him. He hoarded spares, traded coffee to an air crew for a roll of cokes they didn't need, scrounged clamps and tie-downs and grease pencils until the inside of a Sherman turret looked like a child's room where the child had memorized where every toy lived. If the set died, it was back in the conversation in minutes because the crew had practiced the repair like they practiced a broken track drill. The radio was no longer a luxury. It was the part of the tank that let all the other parts behave like a team instead of a neighborhood association arguing about a fence. German tanks in those hills did brilliant things with angles and nulls. They exploited shadow like artists. But brilliance that cannot be told to a neighbor dies the moment a neighbor is asked to guess. You could see the isolation on the battlefield. A panther that had moved to the perfect slant on a slope, and then had to hold it alone, not because its friends were cowards, but because its friends had to choose between seeing and talking, and they chose survival. The Shermans chose to talk and see and move at once. FM made that possible. The net taught them that moving without talking is a way to become a hero on someone else's headstone. Normandy replaced distance with dirt. The bocage was geometry written by a drunk god, hedgerows like walls, sunken lanes like moats, fields like rooms you can't see into without crawling across the threshold. AM would have turned this into a farce. FM turned it into a rehearsal space where the actors could whisper through their cues. Pike's doctrine tightened again. When the world is a maze, nets contract. The platoon frequency carried breaths and angles. The company frequency carried timing and the occasional insult to keep everyone human. The battalion frequency became weather and artillery, and the kind of calm that keeps hands from shaking when they have to repair something while lying under a tank that stinks of hot oil. One afternoon, a panther took up a position on the far side of a hedgerow gap that would have been a murder door if the Shermans had walked in like gentlemen. Pike's company didn't. The mast tank backed into a ditch until its antenna licked the line of sight over 3 fields. The platoon leader in the forward field spoke in numbers as if he were ordering at a diner. Blind 2 lengths, step left 1. Pin 3 o'clock, far row. The right-hand element crawled. The left-hand element paused on a word and then surged on a noun. Artillery put a single round on the Panther's flank hedge to make the crew flinch. The Shermans rolled on the flinch. A gunner whose father had been a tailor stitched 3 rounds into the seam where the Panther's armor made its compromise. From the German perspective, nothing had happened, and then everything had happened. From the net's perspective, everything had been happening the whole time. Breaths, numbers, the small miracles of people agreeing to be silent when silence was what the other person needed. chatter control was the discipline that civilians assume armies have, and armies learn like a bad habit until someone makes it into a religion. Pike banned adjectives. He banned jokes on the net except for the ones that bleed tension just enough to keep hands steady. Short, dry, and finished in a breath. He banned arguments disguised as questions. He banned the form of fear that sounds like a shopping list delivered at speed. He refused to ban fear itself. The net is not the place to pretend that people do not have hearts. It is the place to keep those hearts from interrupting the math. A Sherman driver who said, "Hit blind 2 back," taught the rest of the net that they could be hit and still be in the sentence. That sentence killed more Panzers than any single tank ever did. On the rare days when the net fell apart, an antenna gone, a relay tank killed in the first minute, a mast shadowed by a church, Pike watched the Sherman Company lose a decade of learning in a heartbeat. They reverted to shouting and guessing, the way men always do when the circle breaks. He took those days and wrote them on the same one page as the good ones. The lesson was not that FM performed miracles. The lesson was that discipline makes a miracle repeatable. The Germans had miracles in their barrels. The Americans had routines in their radios. Routines scale. Winter does not care about doctrine. The Ardennes laid a white sheet over everything and then tried to kill batteries for sport. Cold makes wire brittle. It makes men clumsy. It makes a voice sound like a pocket knife opening. Pike wrote a winter addendum in pencil because the ink was thick in the cold. Keep transmit time shorter. Cycle sets on a schedule so no tank's power stage freezes into reluctance. Wrap connectors. Tape crystals against condensation. Put a blanket over the set when a hatch has to be open. Rotate relay duty more often because the massed tank will be targeted the moment the enemy figures out that the battle's brain lives there. Remind officers that a relay dying is a worse event than a spearhead hesitating. Remind drivers that frozen ruts eat cokes the way summer mud eats track shoes. The Ardennes also gave Pike his oddest victory, the kind that makes purists frown. He ran a deception net on a quiet frequency. FM ghosts. A pair of tanks at the back, safe behind folds of ground, ran scripted chatter that sounded like a company forming for a push 2 hedgerows away from where the real push was warming its engine blocks. The German operator who caught the ghost convinced his commander to adjust. The adjustment peeled 2 Panzers off a line and left a seam. The Shermans did not need the seam to be wide. They needed it to be there. The first 3 minutes of the real assault felt like the first clean breath after a chest cold. Then the world returned to normal. Confusion, smoke, numbers, an engine dying at the worst time, and a loader talking the gunner through a short stroke that got them one more shot before the crew bailed into the snow. People who talk about the Ardennes prefer heroics to housekeeping. Pike would have nothing against the former. He simply knew the latter was a better investment. The checklists got longer and shorter at once. He cut words. He added blankets. He traded coffee for batteries with a field workshop that had already turned coffee into the currency of the cold. He rotated antenna masts like chess pieces, never leaving one long enough on the skyline to become a habit the enemy could exploit. When the snow burned off under muzzle flash, the net held. Range fell. Clarity stayed. The difference between a clean left 2 and a garbled left, static 2, is a tank in a ditch or a tank in a firing position. The Ardennes paid for this lesson in men. The net made sure they didn't pay twice for the same square of ground. Crossing into Germany, rivers and towns replaced hedgerows and fields. FM likes water less than men do. It plays tricks with reflections. Urban canyons make radios forget their manners and shout. Pike adapted by making the mast a habit rather than a role. Any tank that found a sight line became the relay for as long as its view held. Infantry platoons were invited to the company net in brief, surgical windows, brought in to say, "Stairs clear" and "corner blind," and then pushed back out so the tanks could keep the tempo. Tank destroyers, who had spent a year being treated as experts with separate alphabets, were handed a phrase book. Engineers came in like carpenters and taught everyone to say, "Gap ready," as if it were the name of a saint. German tanks in towns were at their most terrifying and their loneliest. A Panther at an intersection with a good field of fire is a sermon. It also needs a congregation. Without one, it becomes an anecdote. American companies learned to create congregations on demand. A platoon net could spin a flanking pair around a block. The company net could time the noise with a breech, and the battalion net could keep a battery's attention long enough to settle the question above the debate. The German AM nets, where they were present, died in the reverb. Commands arrived late and left early. A platoon commander had to choose between staying on the radio and staying alive. He chose the latter, and the net withered back into one voice, pressed into a microphone that could not push through the brick. One Panther died cursing a shadow because the voice in its ear had promised a support that could not find the corner with a compass. Pike wrote about the towns like a school teacher. He told crews to speak to buildings as if buildings had ears. Left 2 windows, door, blind. He had learned to love the words that made a shape. He taught gunners to read radio like they read a reticle. Faster, cleaner, no romance. He taught drivers that a good halt is a radio act as much as it is a mechanical one. The net can't work if the mast is on the move in the 1 second the whole company needs the bridge. He taught platoon leaders that they were writers, not talkers. The net was a page they filled with commands that could be understood even if nobody knew their names. By the time they reached the last towns, the Shermans outsang every Panzer they met because the Shermans were a choir and the Panzers were soloists out of breath. By the last spring, Pike's one-pagers had grown polite titles and distribution stamps. Training cadres took them and read them out loud to crews who did not know or care who had written them as long as they kept them alive. The doctrine was not a monument. It was a habit that fit in a pocket. Net setup in 3 minutes. Relay assignment in 2, brevity rehearsal in 1, company attack cadence in 4 lines, artillery hooks in 5 words, air liaison in 10. If a sergeant could not teach it between the gate and the first field, the doctrine was too long. The miracle was not the technology, though the SCR 508 deserved its praise for 25 clean watts and crystals that stayed where you put them. The miracle was the choice to make words move like vehicles and vehicles move like words. Veterans would later talk about the radios with the same humility they used for tracks and guns. They did not call it a revolution. They called it the thing that made revolutions survivable. Some remembered hearing German voices drifting on AM like tired ghosts, orders that sounded important and arrived too late to matter. Some remembered panzers that fought like lions and died like hermits. A few remembered the day they visited a captured German tank park and saw empty racks where radios could have been. The absence explained part of a war. Machines without voices ask too much of their drivers. Officers who grew up in the liturgy of the big gun and the thick plate never wrote prayers for the microphone. Culture is a weapon. The American culture of brief, bossy, useful radio made an average crew lethal. The German culture of extraordinary gunnery and segmented command made an extraordinary crew legendary and too often alone. Why did AM culture miss the revolution? Because revolutions that are not loud do not feel like revolutions. AM had the illusion of reach. FM offered the reality of clarity. Clarity does not throw parades. It closes distance in minds. It lets a corporal be a conductor. It lets a lieutenant be a clock. It lets a captain be a calendar. The glamour is lower. The survival rate is higher. Pike's idea had been called crazy because it reassigned romance away from the turret and down into the net. He did not mind. He was not in this for a poem. He was in it for a number called Back Tomorrow. By the time the last rivers were behind them, the lesson had stopped needing teachers. Networks beat platforms. A single Panther could outshoot a single Sherman. A company of Shermans, breathing through a clean FM net, could make a Panther into a statistic. The principal wore 100 uniforms after 1945. Command and control on ships that learned to speak before they shot. Infantry platoons with handsets that made them articulate in alleys. Aircraft that turned into flying nodes instead of individual tempers. People called it many things: doctrine, C2, network-centric warfare. Pike would have called it talk first. The humility of that phrase hides a century of work. His last mission read like a dare from a younger version of himself. A battalion had to push through a corridor with panzers on either side like teeth. Range was short, sight lines were treacherous, and the only way through was to be faster than fear. The first relay died. The second had its antenna peeled by a branch, and the coax tore like paper. The net fluttered. Pike climbed out of his turret and fixed a connector with his gloves in his teeth, because he could not feel his fingers. He fell back into the tank and said a single word. Up! And the company moved as if the floor had tilted in the right direction. They passed the corridor, not because any one of them was braver than the enemy, but because they could be brave in the same second, for the same reason. He slept for 2 hours that night and dreamed in numbers. He did not collect medals beyond the ones that come with mileage. He kept his one-page sheets in a pocket folder and handed them to anyone who asked, and some who did not. He joked that he was a librarian for a language nobody loved until it saved their lives. What he made was not an invention. It was a decision about how to behave in a room called a battlefield. His radio net did not make Shermans invincible. It made them unlonely. That is the part the Panzers could not match. An invincible tank is a myth. A company that refuses to let any one of its tanks be alone is a fact. A line can be drawn from Kasserine's silence to Germany's receipts. It runs through every place where an FM voice made fear share the room with instruction. The SCR 508's 25-watt discipline, married to crystals that stayed put and brevity that respected seconds, gave an average Sherman crew the superpower of coordination. Opposite them, a collection of German crews operating on patchy AM or on none at all had to guess at what their neighbors were doing. They guessed well, often brilliantly. They guessed alone too often. The myth of the perfect machine, Tiger, Panther, has always had trouble with the fact that men drive wars, not platforms. The overlooked revolution was not a part number. It was a behavior. Talk short, listen hard, move together. Pike's crazy net became ordinary, which is the most honest kind of victory. It disappeared into doctrine, which is where good ideas go to work after the cheering stops. If you read the after-action reports, you hear the voice without hearing the name. Company pivot executed on time. Platoon broke contact per net order. Relay maintained through approach. It is unfashionable to give romance to checklists. Let it be unfashionable. The checklists kept people. The FM carriers were the bloodstream. The brevity codes were the platelets. The relays were the joints. The battalion net was the breath that swallowed panic and exhaled order. The Germans had algebra in their ballistics. The Americans wrote sentences on the air and then stepped into them. If there is a lesson worth pulling forward, it is this. Supremacy comes from conversation before it comes from caliber. A radio that lets a corporal say, "Left 2," and be obeyed without drama across 3 fields is worth more than an inch of armor that convinces a captain he can go it alone. Tanks today carry systems that make Pike's SCR 508 look like a toy, but the grammar he taught still holds. Layer your nets. Pick a quiet brain for NCS. Treat silence as a resource. Rehearse the words as if they were drills. Carry spare cokes like it is ammunition, and never let the enemy turn your net into a crowd. If you do those things, you will outplay machines that look prettier in museums. The boy at Kasserine did not know he was writing doctrine. He knew he was sick of listening to men die in static. That is where revolutions begin. In disgust with noise, in love with clarity, and in the stubborn belief that a voice can be a weapon if you sharpen it and teach it not to waste a second. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them. There is a temptation to treat radios as invisible until they fail. Pike's War argued the opposite. He treated the net as a machine that needed oil, alignment, torque settings, and inspections. He scheduled radio maintenance as if it were gunnery. He measured call duration like fuel. He trained replacements by having them run the net on a quiet day until they earned the right to run it on a loud one. He wrote after-action notes that counted words, not just shells. Crews laughed at first, and then watched a platoon that spoke less kill more, watched a company that rehearsed brevity outrun a problem a mile wide, watched a battalion that trusted its relays make a forest of antennas into a single mind. Technology provided the clean channel. The discipline provided the music. The combination, multiplied across miles of battlefield, is why average machines with voices beat exceptional machines without them.